The major barriers to the transfer of conventional to distance learning have been ensuring equitable student access to technology and training teachers, parents, and children in using an online learning environment. That's according to CQ University education lecturer Corey Bloomfield, who joins me today. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you.
So, Corey, you recently co-authored an article on distance education teachers and their understanding of and strategies for student engagement. Now, what were some of the key focus areas of that article?
Yes, this particular article is one of two that have come out of a research project led by Professor Kate Ames, along with Dr. Lois Harris and Dr. Joe Dargouche, where we looked at a school of distance education and how their teachers conceptualised what it meant to engage students and how they were able to not only identify that, but also what some of the tools and skills that they had in being able to do that. So some of the findings that came out of that study were really looking at the unique challenges that come with trying to evidence whether you have engaged a student online or not, and being able to hopefully build some sense of student agency. So the ability for students to feel as though they have some control and choice and decision making around their learning in that online environment, which in many cases becomes much more teacher directed than student led.
Okay, and in that article, you do make mention of checkpoints. So you mention how teachers can use the online tools to introduce frequent checkpoints within lessons to help them gauge whether a student is, engaging in the coursework or not. So I'm just wondering, what are some of these checkpoints and how do they work?
Yeah, so checkpoints it will depend on the technology that each individual school or classroom is using. We found in the study that that depending on the learning environment that the students were in, there were a range of different strategies and techniques that the teachers used to be able to engage students in checking for understanding, and not only just checking for understanding about learning, but also a check-in for their emotional well-being as well. And the strategies that they used and the types of techniques varied depending on the needs of the individual students, but also the age ranges as well. Because this school of distance education that we conducted the study in worked right from children at kindergarten age through to year 12. Some of the checkpoints that were evidenced through this study with the teachers were looking at being able to engage students through chat box conversations, polling students on different aspects of the learning experience. So getting them to be more interactive in the learning rather than passively learning. Some teachers, they used different emojis to be able to support students, to be able to give the teacher an indication of how well they understood the content or how well they were feeling at the beginning of the lesson or the day and things like that. But then there was also other ways that they were trying to check in with their understanding even outside of those lesson times. So being able to use different programs. One example that was used by one of the primary school teachers there who was working in early years was using a program called Seesaw, where a student was able to send very quickly their work through to their teacher, and the teacher could easily give feedback to them with a lot more immediacy than what they had previously experienced, obviously via email, but even before that, when schools of distance education worked on mail in, mail out of your schoolwork, and you weren't getting feedback for sometimes weeks or possibly even months. So technology is certainly supporting teachers in being able to give feedback at important junctures, whereas that has been, I suppose, more of a stagnated sort of clunky process in schools of distance education previously.
It sounds very innovative that we're now using technology in the classroom that, students outside of the classroom would be using in their day-to-day life. So chatbots, messenger, emojis, who would have thought? I think that's, it sounds really cool.
Yeah.
And is that something that sort of, I guess, came into play when those mechanisms were thought out, that they did need to tap into the technology that was being used outside of the classroom?
Yeah, I think it's something where, as distance education, in the research that we've done, but obviously the literature that we've been working through as well, we've been able to identify that the growth in schools of distance education. So they're certainly getting more students who are opting into distance education in recent years, and that's not just in Australia, but transnationally as well. We've got a case of a broader group of students who are needing that support, and it's not being just about the classroom, the academic learning, but also about the well-being. There are a lot of students who are not being able to cope with the conventional schooling model for various reasons. Some of those around their mental health. Lots of students with high levels of anxiety, social anxiety, and things like that. The general school environment can be quite daunting, and on medical advice often move into distance education. So things like using emojis, using chat boxes to be able to express emotions without having to talk in front of the class, being able to record your oral presentation or do it in a breakout room with a small group of students and things like that. Some of the strategies that I suppose moving from the mainstream classroom into the online learning is certainly happening, but we're also seeing that the inverse effect as well, with a lot of blended learning opportunities as well.
All right. So you mentioned there sort of emotional and well-being support. So how does technology and pedagogy help distance education teachers better monitor and support the behavioural and cognitive engagement of their diverse student group?
Yep, excellent question. I guess it's something where the cognitive engagement, as I mentioned earlier, is really trying to be able to get students to engage through agentic learning. So we talk about different types of engagement, and you hit on one there with behavioural engagement, but also having a sense of agency and really choosing to engage in the learning and being able to help them facilitate that journey. That's something that we identified in the study as being an area that is certainly a hot topic for distance education and online learning, about how we go about doing that better and being able to hopefully support our students in being able to do that more effectively. The behavioural engagement, and that came out fairly strongly in being able to have those check-in points and be able to identify if that student is listening to or doing the learning activity and things like that. And obviously if within the tertiary education sector, we are able to identify how many clicks that they're having on their Moodle site and things like that. In the distance ed that we had, they didn't have the same learning platform as we do at CQUniversity, but that's an area that they can sort of work on around behavioural engagement. Being overcome a kid who just decides they're not going to show up to the lesson, that's a bigger issue, of course. So if you think about behaviour, in that sort of more blunt sort of a way, or switching off their microphone or camera and things like that, there are those sort of tools to be able to deal with a student who's might be having some behavioural difficulties, but that was not identified by the participants in the study as much of an issue with online learning. It was more about the difficulties that come with using technology, the complications that come. That was probably more of a stressor for teachers who teaching in the online environment. The classroom behaviours that teachers in a face-to-face conventional schooling model were certainly lessened. So it was a bit of a trade-off, I suppose, in that they felt as though they didn't have to deal with the behaviours as much, given that that remote learning environment there. But I guess the way that they work around those issues is really good communication with parents, and often, particularly with the younger students, they have either parents or designated home tutors there with them supporting. Not so much in the secondary grades, but definitely still that high level of communication with parents around the engagement of their child in the learning process.
I think that's a great trade-off, to be honest, quickly learning technology, but not having to deal with, the high level of students who might, not engage in a classroom setting, but are obviously choosing to engage in technology, which is, a positive that I see anyway. Now, you did mention parents just then, and parents are obviously playing a big role at the moment, especially in the secondary and primary sector. Now, are strong relationships with students and parents necessary for effective engagement?
Based on the findings from this particular study, we were looking only at teacher perceptions, but teachers'
Okay.
perceptions were certainly that yes, the level of parent engagement was core to them being able to maintain that engagement in the learning process. So it was a shared journey of not just the teacher and the student, but teacher, student, and parent, very much more so. And from what anecdotally from my experience working in both distance education and in conventional schooling models, seeing that there was certainly a lot more communication between teachers and parents in that environment compared to my experiences in mainstream. Probably, that's something that we picked up on. It was obviously a pilot study where we were looking at the teachers' perceptions. We are currently in negotiations to further our research in this area of student engagement, both in conventional and distance learning environments. So really trying to hopefully be able to build upon this first study and be able to look at engaging students and within that research and parents as well. So hopefully we will get some more information around how best to engage our learners within that, I suppose, triad of working with parents, teachers and students.
Okay, that's good news that this has potential to grow. I think the transition to distance education has really changed the research landscape. We have other sectors of the university looking into different ways we can improve, I guess, our online engagement as well. So that's great. Now, you mentioned that teachers, with the transition, teachers did find adjusting to technology difficult. Were there any other engagement sort of initiatives that they struggled with throughout the transition?
I think that was probably key from what came from the teachers who were participants in the study about when they came to become teachers of a school of distance education was that was the steep learning curve was the use of technology. And it's not just the ability to operate the technology and troubleshoot all the issues that come with that, with students not being able to use the technology themselves, having to teach their new students how to use the technology, issues with bandwidth and things like that. We've got students in remote areas and how to work around issues like that. But really, it was about the pedagogical differences as well. That they'd use the skills that they'd use to teach in a classroom environment, in a face-to-face environment. Those were transferable, but they had to think differently about how they were teaching and how they set up their lessons, how they develop their resources to be able to better suit that online learning environment. So it was a pedagogical change, not just a technological one.
Okay, and that also brings me to my next question. What are some of the great practices in terms of digital pedagogy being undertaken in Australian schools of distance education right now? You could use CQUniversity as an example, but if you have come across any others, I'm sure our audiences would love to hear them.
Yeah, I think so. If we just base it within this particular study, the teachers, some of their reflections were that it was about building those quality relationships with not just students, but obviously, in the primary school setting, the parents, and even in the high school setting. Creating a safe classroom environment was also key. So still considering the fact that you've got a very diverse group of students there who have diverse needs. So understanding that and differentiating your teaching practice and how you engage those learners for their individual needs was important. Also using inclusive technological tools to facilitate those interactions and monitor that progress, and doing that in a way that it's not just about checking to make sure that they're on task and understanding the learning, but also trying to make learning fun for them and relevant as well. So being able to work within those structures that you've got there. A lot of them drew upon school-wide pedagogical frameworks and teaching strategies. So that's something that, as you sort of mentioned there about what we do with CQUniversity, that's something where pedagogical frameworks and teaching strategies might happen within schools within the university, but as far as a university university-wide pedagogical framework about how we teach online at CQ University. That's an area that that's obviously open for opportunity there. But also the other key issue that teachers found out about how they needed to try and engage students in that online environment was being able to encourage students to self-regulate, I suppose their learning behaviours, in being able to make them more independent as learners, because they weren't there with them from 9 to 3. They might have had a few different lessons through the day with them, but there's a lot more time, as most online learners know, where you're independently studying, going through coursework and having to work at your own pace and stay engaged. So that's something where a lot of these young people who are going through schools of distance education, or given our current situation where a lot of our young Australians are learning online and or maybe learning from home, via hard copy work, there is opportunities here to be able to develop a lot more self-regulation about their learning behaviours, developing that independence in their learning, rather than having to rely on the authority of the teacher to direct them in their learning. So really helping prepare them for adult learning environments, where that be in vet or higher ed, regardless, it is much more independent. So this could actually be a great way to transition students from a secondary schooling into further education and training as well.
And just an extension of that, do you think it's also preparing students for the working world? Where technology is becoming very evident in almost every profession out there. So I guess they're getting a taste very early on as to what work life could look like down the track.
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to communicate effectively via email, setting up meetings via Outlook, or whatever the platform happens to be, is certainly keys to be able to help them with that transition to work. But even if we're looking at professional development in work environments, on the job training, a lot of it is online learning packages. So it is helping them for those situations as well. And I think as we sort of move, it's not just about the work environment. Social environments now are very much online, given our current circumstances even more so, but that's technology has been assisting us not only with our work environments but also our social interactions as well. So certainly a way of the future.
Okay, and given that there sounds to be a lot of benefits of this, and with strategies in place to help teachers and students, do you think if we are to go back to normal, and hopefully that's sooner rather than later, that this sort of online distance learning and engagement will form part of the teaching future?
Yeah, I definitely think it's an opportunity for us to think about doing school differently. Reshaping that model of what is normal, and given the technological capabilities that we currently possess, really giving this as a time for us to reflect on how we teach our next generation of young Australians coming through, and what messages we are trying to send them, how are we shaping them, whether we maintain the norm, which is still working within very much an industrialised model of schooling, to one where it is much more open and learning is a much more organic process, and seeing how that can fit in with our current structures that we have in place will be a very interesting time.
Now, I just want to say thank you for joining me today and sharing some great insights into the teaching world and how teachers are, engaging with students when they probably, not all the time can see who they're engaging with. So I think that was, it was great. And until I see you next time, stay safe. And thank you.
Thanks, Jess.